Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today I am sick and somewhat nasal, and therefore will probably not be putting you through listening to me talk very much unless we get a really good match coming up for someone somewhere.
Round one. Fight!
But you are likely to see different setups and different characters today, as our team is back from the tournament they went to, and they have specific things they're both looking at and checking for in their own playstyles. Not to mention the upcoming potential beta test for Street Fighter 6, which, again, even if we did get in, we probably wouldn't tell you. But you'll probably be seeing the results of quite a lot of practice and thinking over the next hour or so.
Round two.
And the launch will fill up more as we go further. So, enjoy it. Join in if you would like to. This is, as usual, our more or less Atlantic Rim Lounge. If you are able to get into that with a decent connection, and probably, because it's Street Fighter, if you're not on Wi-Fi. Let's see what happens.
Mika wins. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Mika wins. It's go time. Let's do this. Chun-Li.
さあ行くわよ
Rainbow
バッチリ
Mika.
決めてくっすよ かましたねおっしゃ行くぞ私のクンフー見せてあげる
Round 1. Fight.
えってれっしゃ飛行拳負けないせやどうだてれえっビッグバーキー恨みっこなしよ
Round 2. Fight.
負けないいただきドンいやさあ飛行拳やったそれてれ飛行拳
You win. Round 1. Fight. いいクンフーだ Round 2. Fight. Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight. Final round. Fight. You lose. Let's do this.
Obviously you all can't hear it, but I've been coughing terribly for the last couple of minutes. But we are in fact getting another Mika versus Cammy match with the same V-skill and V-trigger as before. So let's see what happens with the different styles. I'm not necessarily going to say a lot, but I'm just bringing to attention the fact that we now have the contrast. Our Cammy style is pretty well rounded. I'd say she's a fairly natural Cammy, so you don't necessarily have any specific thing to look out for. And I figured, I don't know, just instinct tells me that this person will be similar with slightly more footsies maybe. But overall, another natural Cammy that has to be fought very carefully relative to playing in neutral, using the crouch and stand heavy punch correctly, and recognizing when you just don't have advantage and can't push too hard. Yeah, it's looking basically the same, so hopefully they both get lots of good practice.
Round two. Fight.
And it's always fun to engage with a fairly natural player of a character, particularly when they have enough footsie skill that they don't have to fall back to doing something other than playing footsies. As no matter how good most players are, if they're lacking that, if you're too good at footsies yourself, or are winning too hard, the match devolves simply because they can't afford to fight you in footsies, so they have to retreat a bit and then come up with, or try to get to their other condition. Through no specific fault of theirs, it's not like this is the only plan they had, but they want to play as best they can to give you a challenge or to at least try to win, and sometimes that doesn't work out if you don't have enough footsies to stand up to a different player. The same thing happens with zoners when you just don't have the skill at bulldogging or avoiding things to get through the zoning. You'll probably have to shift altogether to something that's possibly less fun for both of you.
Mika wins. Round one. Fight.
I've not seen that one before. Probably because people wouldn't have had much reason to use it other than a specific setup when they're getting out of the corner. The Cammy is not usually the one trying to escape from corner situations.
Round two. Fight. Mika wins.
You're going to see quite a lot of shuffling around today, as not all of us have as much stamina as we might like to play through everything. That also means that if you're joining our lounge today, you should expect to be able to rotate around a little faster. I'm not sure they'll be hanging around because they don't necessarily know that unless they're watching, but so it is.
Let's do this.
Well, that match wasn't much of a contrast because, as I said, I had the feeling that that player was going to be a very natural Cammy style, trying to make use of everything she does, and not so much relying on any particular shenanigans or pressure. And that's more or less what we got. But if you want to practice footsies, today is all footsie people. Especially if you want to brush up on your speed as well, because, well, our guest NBK5 Nat is not always footsies, they're always fast.
Round one. Fight.
One of the problems our Cammy does have, though, is what happens when opponents, particularly within the group, are warmed up with their footsie game, as it forces her to be more and more daring, and also to learn both to not do certain approaches and to dive kick more often. Not necessarily because the dive kick is a great idea or is normally safe, but simply because you have to keep your opponent on their toes, you have to keep them thinking about things, and you have to be able to therefore do practically instant dive kicks from playing neutral in order to bypass neutral. You're not really hoping most of these hit, but you are definitely hoping that your opponent thinks about them enough that you can do the rest of your stuff in neutral. Putting this extra strain on yourself, though, can be quite a bit. So if you aren't too familiar with how to get particularly good dive kicks done relative to your own purposes, we suggest our Laura bot for this, mainly because Laura moves in ways and advances in neutral in ways that force you to use it, and this works regardless of whether or not she actually is input particularly well. So even a relative beginner, in terms of bot input or execution, can just fudge through whatever they can manage on the Laura bot and will generally get something useful enough out of it to practice Cammy dive kicks with. I forget whether or not RuneSiren actually has a quote-unquote good Laura bot, or possibly any Laura bot at all, since we do not all have bots on our accounts, mostly so we can do testing, but I think she has one.
Mika wins.
And since it seems I'm back to coughing, it looks like the stream will be back to silence for a while.
Round one. Fight. Round 2. Fight. Mika wins. It's go time.
Alright, it looks like Jet Fighter did not stick around this time, which is not really a shame per se. I guess they looked and saw whether or not their paint got any better. You shouldn't generally assume that if you have 1 bar or even 2 bars to us but manage to get into the lounge, that this means that we won't play. Sometimes that's perfectly fine and there's nearly no visible lag. But if you are on Wi-Fi, or you know that for whatever reason your ISP's throughput is unstable, it's probably not going to work for anyone. And that seems to be the problem they face most of the time when they try to join. Now, let's see who we get today. R.Mika is normally a Shoto player, as they're called, and can quickly rush down in situations you wouldn't expect people to rush down, particularly after being so sedate in neutral most of the time. But they're very good at it, and it's a good way to improve against the mindset of getting into a space and mentally going, okay, I know what's going to happen now. And while I can provide that, I actually play a charge character who does in fact have to slow down a little bit, or at least loses some access to certain moves and combos if she doesn't. You'd think that her dash was bad given how poorly I use it.
Round 1.
But you'll never get that impression from this player's Ryu, so one of the main things that comes up in this matchup a lot is that you're always being very perfectly set up to jump out over the wrong Hadouken. You'll notice that whenever R.Mika is not at a specific range, the Hadouken just isn't thrown, you get the jabs. The jab's purpose is simply to make you think that something is going to happen, but also to make sure I'm not throwing the Hadouken here, I don't want to throw it here. There's a lot of very precise spacing going on in this matchup at all times, and therefore catching this player can often be an extreme challenge. One of the main ways to resolve this, I feel, is to count on the fact that Ryu actually doesn't whiff punish certain things very well. Movement-based normals are not one of his strong points. He has his own, but they take quite long to animate, and the reaction to certain things isn't so great. Using this in combination with your backdash, and without aiming to actually hit the player, is probably your best bet a lot of the time. Just understand that you will be putting yourself at greater risk by doing this if your opponent slows down enough to think about trying to counter them. But quite simply, that's not really important to you as the player doing these things. You don't need to think about it. Your goal is to get closer and then watch for a shift. Because he can't just hit you most of the time, sometimes he can sweep if you do the spacing wrong, but mostly you use a move to get closer to him, and he then has to reposition either forward or backward. And you probably have enough time to respond to one of those two things. So this is pretty simple as an overall feeling, but you shouldn't really think of it as something that's actually easy to do. It can be very tempting to jump in this situation more than you need to, but often that just puts you where the player wants you to be. So, Think of it that way. Use a move to advance, and then once you've done that, consider whether or not your opponent is going to go back or forward, and that's it.
Round 2. Fight.
If they needed to do neither of those things, chances are you didn't do it right. Your movement was wrong in some way. Another helpful point is to just mess with this type of opponent by backdashing yourself, but because they're so trained in the exact same thing that they're good at doing, it's unlikely you'll get away if you try, because they'll just dash behind you. They're thinking in the same way. Should I go forward or back based on whatever they see you do? But notice that if you've reached the point where you basically never feel fear of your opponent's jump at all, because you're never going to be in a position where you even have to uppercut it, you can think purely in terms of forward and back, and everything works out from there.
Let's do this.
In turn, the better you get at doing this, the more practice the opponent will get. Because the thing that NBK5NAT would need to work on based on this is whiff punishing when the opponent does place themselves incorrectly. Especially getting themselves to not dash in those timings and spaces where you did it right. For Cammy, this is a little harder, but not a lot, because Cammy's movement forward normals are much slower. Basically, she only has forward heavy kick, and to some extent, crouch heavy punch. But neither of these things are particularly good at advancing.
For those who I wish to protect.
Round 1.
But she does walk quite fast, and in that option of walking quite fast and understanding that because she walks so fast you can do this, you can get through another situation. You see there that the opponent is forced to use Hadoukens to respace the position to solve the problem. And Cammy can of course just backdash out of many situations as well, where other characters would have to care about what happened. But there's that moment of needing to be ready about something. There's not much chance that you'll get a lot in terms of her other moves, but she can barely sometimes get away with doing that. The spacing you want to do it at from, though, is you have to distract your opponent from the fact that you're at that spacing by giving them the impression that you want to advance. If you have them watch you move backward, or they get out of range, then you'll just get beat up. One benefit, of course, she has is that she is able to just do the EX spiral arrow. But even this is very reaction heavy, meaning that one of her only real secret weapons in this matchup against this specific player type is to just use Light Hooligan and not do anything. At worst, you'll get hit by a Hadouken most of the time. Your opponent might dash up, but it usually doesn't help them. Working this into your flow can be really helpful if you can think of when the opponent won't throw the fireball. Ooh, dropped. So you can see a lot of stuff here that is specifically, okay, I'm doing spacing things and hoping you don't catch me with your spacing things. But you can definitely reduce damage a lot in this way, and that's pretty important. The style that our Ryu uses is very powerful, but very weak in terms of output most of the time, with the benefit being that it generally doesn't use much if any meter. meaning you are always in danger of just being deleted by Hadouken or something similar, or some long combo that they've managed to get up. Which is also a good reason that you can't often go in on wake up as much as you'd like. But if you get a good life lead and just play it out from there pretty slowly, it's not usually as bad. In fact, it's best to make sure that you don't just die because you've gone in on wake up one too many times. That's a dumb way to lose generally. But you can see it play out here. The low damage generally done while in the defensive form of this style really puts a kink in Ryu's general flows. So you just have to think about the match more so as trying to spar with the character than explicitly trying to beat up the player, because the player can't be beaten up in the way that you're usually experiencing it. It is definitely a good sort of player against whom to practice stuff like that, where you're just trying to get perfect spacing on an attack so that your opponent can't actually attack you. It's a good thing to come up. See here, for example, there's no fireball being thrown, and the reason for that is as noted before.
Ryu wins.
So, from that perspective, that was a really good match, in that both players were pushed to working on the thing that they needed to work on the most. They had to both do a very specific and somewhat stressful thing.
It's go time.
Chun-Li's moves for doing this are slightly more whiff punishable, but it's more so that she's not very good at hitting a very defensive Ryu playing in this flow, and the reaction required for dealing with the dash is physically difficult, a bit more than I liked having to deal with. But this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do anything. It means that the strategy for winning isn't necessarily the strategy you might see employed most of the time. So my strategy for winning this match is to not deal with any of the problem at all. If my opponent isn't going to be able to advance because Chun's options for keeping that from happening are so good, there's really not a lot to worry about. Forcing the opponent to get all of their timings right is more important than getting your own. So the match turns out being very, very even, and a sort of slow that I don't personally like. And that was me dropping that, so obviously that's not going to go well. But at least you can push yourselves to think differently about what's required for the matchup. Ooh, gutsy. Super gutsy. But correct. There's that meter. An entire match based around forcing the other person to drop something is something you tend to see only at the highest of levels, because to play that way for that long is actually extremely straining mentally. You can't actually think through or plan pretty much anything. It's not all reactions, but it is definitely a lot of reactions. That, for example, needs to be done way differently than I did it. And every time you mess up any reaction, your opponent's already done something. This isn't the case where you're being defended against for long periods. And both of us are willing to use a lot of energy to get this right. But every miss, every rethink, every physical thing that you must do so quickly because you don't actually know what just happened with any certainty is another stressor. Was that meaty real? Was that a real makeup? Can I backdash out of that? Am I plus there? Should I block this? The stat gets pretty high. And see, we both exactly come to the point in that moment of not knowing whose turn it is, and we just stop. It is a good way to learn a lot of meaties though, because training yourself to get your meaty right, to recognize whether or not you're plus in a situation on reaction, is a type of hit confirm. And for games that have a lot of O-key pressure and setups where you have to rethink your approach to pressure on very short notice, require a lot of practice for this. That, for example, was kind of a miss, but kind of my opponent just knowing, if I jump here you can't hurt me this way, so I should at least do something. And this is what I mean when I say they've built up a lot of speed. Getting this right this many times requires all the speed. We generally refer to this as the evasion stat when we're playing against each other. Knowing that that will work, for example, or to go for that at all. I really expected super there, for example, but my opponent's reaction ability is actually fast enough that I doubt they would have actually been tricked into doing the super. Plus, they still need it for the next round, so most likely they're thinking through very specifically, what is the thing I can do here that will win me this without using the meter I need to potentially win the next? And I forgot the actual way I'm supposed to deal with that.
You lose.
But if I had time to jump, I probably had enough time to do Nickel Punch, I guess. It probably just wouldn't have reached. Onward, therefore.
Let's do this.
So in general, Bison is too slow for this. Jury is too light for this. Cody can work, but it's actually more accurate to say that R.Mika's best bet is to play Mika. The problem with playing Mika in this matchup, in the way that we've seen it done, is that she has to play V-Trigger, V-Skill 1, and V-Trigger 2, and she has to do this with a very, very precise intention that can be beaten if you aren't careful. But it is still a good way to train just emptying your mind long enough to get all your stuff working. But you can see it already. Mic Performance, Steel Chair. This isn't necessarily, in a way, going to solve the problem, but it's similar to how she faces the Akuma matchup. The opponent can't just stand at the other end of the screen, because V-Skill and V-Trigger will lead to too much function. The problem is that understanding when you can throw the mic and when you must hold it is a big deal. Fortunately, you can see part of it here. The more space between the two of them, the more likely it is that mic is just a generally good idea. This isn't changed necessarily by the fact that there is EX buttons to use. And that is the other half of this. Once you've got enough meter, you can just play out the rest of it with the shift alone. You don't need to worry about as much anymore, because before, without V-Shift as an option, you really couldn't do that much in this matchup if you were fighting in this way. You get stuck because you're then sitting on meter that Ryu is just going to try to make you waste. But as soon as she has enough for one V-Shift, she can move to, okay, I'm coming at you now. I'm going to play this out. Because if the opponent is playing this quickly, they can't easily bait the V-Shift. It's too intentional. It's too much thinking for what they are trying to do in this matchup at this time. But we will see a lot more of the slightly problematic tendency to jump, not necessarily because it's a terrible idea to jump, and I'm basically saying that she should never do it, but what you are jumping for can be messed up or off in some way. The goal of jumping in this matchup can't be what you'd normally expect it to be, because as I said at the beginning, that's what our Ryu is setting up from the very start. The only goal you can have for jumping is to put your opponent on edge. If you don't think your jump is going to do that, then there was no point in doing it. In fact, in general, that's the best way to think of it. If Ryu is likely to either stand there or just relax and throw a fireball or uppercut when you jump, then you are going to die and you should neutral jump instead of jumping forward. If you can't make yourself not jump, neutral jump just because if you are going to be damaged by it, your opponent has to consider how to get to you in time to hurt you for jumping. But in Mika's case, she has her crouch heavy punch and her crouch medium punch, which isn't as good at moving, but sometimes you don't want something that's that good at moving. Her crouch heavy punch is actually so difficult to punish for most characters that all she has to do is to get Ryu stop throwing Hadoukens at all. you'll notice that the positioning that our Ryu uses is really susceptible to that move under most circumstances in pure neutral. If they've already started to engage, there's all sorts of other things that probably need to happen. But if they're just quiet in neutral, there's so much that she can do and so much she can set up by just using this move that it becomes too hard for Ryu to keep up with literally everything. This also allows her to spend some more time considering when Ryu will jump. And every time Ryu moves out of that range where it would be a good idea to do the crouch heavy punch, then it's time to use the mic, more or less. But you might also want to consider, wait, will he jump now? Most matches can be broken down to that sort of thing. Is it a good idea for him to jump here? No? Then I'm probably fine. And all of this achieves pushing him back quite a bit, which leads to better options for you. See? This spot can't necessarily react in time. The whole thing just gets played out more and more. You'd think that this is more difficult, but because her defense is so generally good, it just ends up building up a lot of options for Mika's side. I mean, yes, sure, our Ryu is already there, but he's kind of stuck, so it doesn't really matter as much.
Ryu wins.
So once again, a good relatively explosive flow, and we know what both these players need to work on both sides. For that match, NBK5Nat needs to not give so much on the space, to backdash less, so that he doesn't keep on creating the situation that Mika can take advantage of. Because getting the life lead and having that play out as it did just now is one thing, but when you don't have the life lead against Mika, especially if she manages to get that far without you actually throwing her health down to like half, there's always the chance that you're just going to be deleted no matter how much of your own meter you built up. She just kind of doesn't care. One of the things Ryu can do to deal with this is to jump, but he has to do it at a timing that I don't think is very good for most strategy in terms of the gameplay. But I think I would probably need to see for sure. I feel like his jumping heavy kick will whiff on that crouch heavy punch a lot of the time, and that's what I'm basing this on. If that's not true, please ignore what I just said. I'm not confused, am I? I'm fairly sure that Light Hooligan is the one that basically doesn't go anywhere. You need that a lot in this match, because by the time your opponent has reacted to the fact that you've used the Light Hooligan, Cammy is at the height where she gets to decide and they don't. And that's really important for most of your planning. Because you don't have to plan. You just do the Hooligan, de-stress yourself because you're already in the air, and watch your opponent. In fact, the faster your opponent is, the more likely it is that this style of movement helps you more. You don't have to know exactly where you are. Your opponent needs to know where you are. And you can just do a move and then relax that you've gotten into position correctly. Even if you get beaten like that, you can start to work out, well, what would happen if I did this instead in that space? As I noted before, this is a lot more about making your opponent think about the fact that you will do it, similar to the neutral jump, than it is explicitly about getting the Hooligan to succeed at doing just about anything. You're just raising your own defense, or I guess evasion, by not being where you could easily be dealt with.
Round one.
You're going to get hit for this, but you're not going to get hurt a lot for this. This frees her up to play a lot more footsies, as you're seeing. because the opponent has to spend more time thinking about, okay, is it hooligan time? Should I be ready here? And with that happening, you just have to figure out when they switched modes from one to the other. If you think they're watching for hooligan, footsies time. And if you think they are waiting for footsies, then obviously it might be hooligan time. I think that's plus. But I guess she didn't really want to risk doing that because you could just be uppercutted or supered, and that might have been meant to be it. We're going into the last on-stream match of the night. Or rather, this is probably the last on-stream match of the night. The lounge is likely to stay open for a while. And it's relatively intense already, so you can jump in if you want. As always, this is again our NA lounge. There's the uppercut. But you can probably join us tomorrow. I'm not sure because, again, sickness and a bunch of other rotation things. In fact, I don't think the Wolf actually made it into this lounge either, so I don't even know whether or not we're having Melty Blood tomorrow. But we're more likely to have Melty Blood than we are to have Wednesday Night in Birth. No, there he is. Okay then. Our Feeling Thursday Battle Lounge will also be happening. Oh right, this is the one that they don't play because of the connection, I think. Oh, well, no, not this time. Either way, watch out for something on Friday. We're not sure what. Possibly there will be a new bot to poke at. But this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org, and any information about whether we are streaming at around 7:30 Eastern on our Twitter 2_MK_FGC. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.